for honorable speaker, if you can remember it, but it's a big deal. So I congratulate the teams who have made it this far. In opening government, we have Glasgow A. In opposition, we have WUDC A. In closing government, we have IBUDA. And in closing opposition, we have Sydney C. So without any further ado, I call the Prime Minister forward to defend the motion. Your turn.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. We see a pressing problem today when the rates of cyber attacks on companies are increasing, when we see increasingly other governments or perhaps terrorist groups using proxy cyber hacker groups to attack certain corporations as a means of economic warfare, or simply to steal or gain money or gain other data that can then be sold on and funneled to organised crime, and an increase in the kind of lone wolf hacker type things where it's your sort of traditional hacker groups of a few kids doing it for the kicks, essentially trying to, or perhaps trying to make some money at the side. We see corporations often incur significant economic loss from this, like at the point at which lots of personal data is stolen. They often have to completely rework their security measures to try and protect that. If information about their future plans is stolen and sold on to competitors, there's a risk of that being sold on to competitors. They may have to rework certain plans they're trying to do in the future, and it's just a case of even if it's just a case of disabling their systems, that might mean that, say, an airline company isn't able to operate for a few days. They incur massive economic loss as a result of this. We see that the state is often unwilling to police these kind of situations, either because cybercrime, because often it's quite difficult to do so. We see that because often lawmakers don't particularly understand the kind of challenges associated with cybercrime, notice it's a particularly fast evolving field and they're not well able to regulate it. Police units on cybercrime tend to be very underfunded because there's not a lot of public pressure to deal with attacks on big corporations. As the public tend to want to see more policemen on the beat, that kind of narrative, rather than focusing on this kind of thing. And we see that the legislation can often be very slow to keep, and often it's very difficult to try and discover well after the fact, at the point at which the state determines a cyber attack has occurred, a point at which you go through the bureaucracy of investigating it. It's often going to be difficult to trace the attack, especially if it's a thing like a distributed denial of service attack using rented servers. Okay. We say furthermore, there might often be a lack of interest on the part of the state to do this at the point at which they suspect that it's the North Korean government using a proxy group. The United States government may be unwilling, and there may be harmful geopolitical effects of the government then directly trying to fight back against these hacker groups. Okay. I'm going to give a bit of I'll explain what the mechanism is just now. We think it's legitimate for companies to retaliate using some kind of electronic means that either A, removes the ability of these groups to further carry out these attacks. So this would be a thing at the point at which companies are able to determine what IP addresses these attacks are coming from. They can then launch their own distributed denial of service attacks to try and crash these servers. Or secondly, at the point at which they know where these attacks are, if they're able to discover where these attacks are coming from, they're able to hack the servers themselves as corporations to discover the identity of these people, which they can then pass on to the relevant authorities. Okay. We think they have to meet a reasonable balance of probability in order to do this. You have to be able to reasonably determine, I know it's obviously possible that mistakes can be made when you're tracing things on the internet. You have to be able to demonstrate a reasonable balance of probability. If they do this wrongly, they can obviously get sued. We think this gives them a very strong incentive to behave in the correct manner, as the kind of loss you'd incur from getting sued by someone who outweighs any loss to you otherwise. Okay. Yeah, actually, I'll take closing now.
Would you encourage individuals who fall prey to, say, dating scams or Nigerian hacking scammers to take matters into their own hands?
Probably not. No. We think that we think first of all that's not necessarily related to, that's not a hacking attack. That's just trying to trick you. Okay. We don't think that's quite the same thing as doing or inflicting direct economic damage on you. Okay. We say at the point where also individuals probably aren't able to, so it's a bit of a moot point. We think corporations have lots of money, they're able to hire in lots of expertise to be able to carry out these attacks effectively. What happens if corporations don't do this? We think it essentially means that they're just sort of sitting ducks waiting for the next attack. Currently there's no loss to a hacker group of a failed attack. They're able to just sort of repeatedly try again. And secondly, at the point at which these attacks are on the rise and there's no means of retaliation, if states aren't retaliating, if states aren't able to properly investigate this, say if these attacks are being done on American corporations coming from servers based in North Korea or based in Russia, we say this encourages more groups to take apart this. So why do we say that this is legitimate? First of all, we think it's legitimate for individuals or organizations to take means to defend themselves at the point where the state state is either unwilling or unable to do so. Notice that if someone comes to break into your house and try to steal your stuff, it's perfectly legitimate to like whack them over the head with a club in an act of self-defense if the state isn't there to protect you, essentially. We say this is obviously far less of a kind of like moral harm here, at the point at which you're not actually physically harming anyone, you're just trying to remove their ability to further harm you yourself, okay? We say at the point where these attacks often, like we say, the internet is essentially an unregulated space where the state is very bad at regulating, or is perfectly unwilling, or is often quite unwilling to regulate, okay? We say this isn't quite the same as attacks that are happening in the real world. We say the right to self-defense, however, still applies. Like the fact that working on the internet is often a necessity for companies to be able to carry out businesses. They often need to be able to hold personal details of their customers and to be able to keep those safe and secure. We say like companies have the right to be able to defend these and not have their business shut down by groups of hackers who are specifically breaking the law or who are acting illegitimately in terms of being able to do this. They have a right to try and take out these hackers themselves. Okay. So what do we think the effects of this are like? So what do we think the likely effects of these are going to be like? Well, number one is obviously going to be a deterrence effect. Okay. At the point at which there is literally, like, even if it were to be somewhat marginal, at the point at which there is literally no cost to a hacker group of a failed attack, at the point at which they can attack with impunity, there's an incentive just to attack again and again and again and again. Eventually, you will break in and do the corporation some significant economic damage, or at least there is significant loss to the corporation for having to repeatedly defend themselves against these kind of attacks. We say like there is a deterrence effect at the point at which you are I believe, either able to crash the kind of servers that the attacker group is using. This is probably going to be very expensive, especially at the point where hackers don't have access to the same resources as corporations. Hackers might not be able to afford to buy these servers again or rebuild their kind of computers. Or secondly, at the point at which you discover the identities of these lone wolf hackers, I think at the point at which we see more and more people being prosecuted for hacks, people are less inclined to view it as a bit of fun and just something we might try do on the off chance in order to try and gain some expertise. We say in the case of where it is like it's governments like North Korea who are using this as proxy attacks on Sony Pictures, we say this is much better than the comparative, which is either allowing these governments to continue doing it with impunity, which probably fuels demands in the American public for retaliation against North Korea to some respect, or B, is the United States government actually retaliating against these hackers themselves. We say that's the point at which that's the kind of thing we want to avoid. But there's going to be some pressure to eventually stop these hacks. Either has to come through the US bombing North Korea, obviously a bad thing, or through the US government directly launching these kind of aggressive attacks against these hackers themselves. We say that is again also probably worse at the point that is likely to ramp up rhetoric and further increase tension. We think like it's probably quite a good thing if corporations are able to deter. Like we think lone wolf hackers doing this can often be quite a big problem as well. At the point at which these people are often people who are involved in other kinds of crime. Okay, like this may be being done in order to fund organized crime because it's seen as a fairly inexpensive way of trying to gain large amounts of data. At the point at which there's retaliatory attacks and your computers are getting fried or a few of your members are getting arrested, we see this becomes less sort of. Well, we say organized crime views this as a less good means to try and gain more crime. We think that takes away some funding for them. We say secondly, the kind of lone wolf hackers carrying this sort of thing out are the kind of people who are likely to be operating in the unregulated part of the internet where you have things like child pornography being sold. I think managing to arrest a few of these people, I think managing to like break up the kind of hacker groups that are associated with this when we find out some of their details is probably a good way to do this. And for Madam Speaker, this is just a good idea. For all these reasons, we urge you to propose the motion.
Before I call the Leader of the Opposition, let's all take a minute to turn our cell phones on silent or airplane mode. And with that, I invite the Leader of the Opposition forward and the motion that's been.
Sorry, I think I have to listen. Sorry. right, honorable speaker. So before I go into my speech, I want to analyze the context in which this debate is probably occurring. So this is occurring in a context where the state might be unwilling or unable to retaliate, right? What does this mean? Firstly, it's probably because they have good reason to adopt a more diplomatic or conciliatory approach, in that they probably have a good alternative already available for them to settle this dispute. Or they suspect the attack was decentralized and simply responding to the suspected organization that did this attack is going to be ineffective. Secondly, because they cannot back such a challenge, right? It might be incredibly dangerous for them to retaliate, especially if the possible hacker was like a state actor, and actually it might involve the country of which that corporation is from into a serious military dispute. Thirdly, I think it's because they also prefer the rule of law to settle these disputes rather than like private actors who cannot be guaranteed to act in a legal way. So we think that the state does care about terrorist groups, and they do care about cyber attacks because it harms them, especially if important information is being compromised. If they don't care, or they're unwilling to do, if they're unwilling or unable to respond, they probably have good reason. I'm going to analyze this. Further note, I think a good way to contextualize this is also like there's two scenarios here, right? The state is hacking another state is attacking the corporation, or another corporation is attacking the corporation. I'm going to analyze how in both of these circumstances this is a bad idea. So why is this the bad idea? Firstly, I think this promotes the general permissibility of cyber attacks, even if it is like retaliatory, and thus weakens the rule of law, especially intellectual property law. So in the context of corporations versus corporations, what you see is like Chinese companies making their own phones, hacking Apple or Google or whatever, trying to get like phone copies or something like that, right? So I think this resolution legitimizes cyber attacks as a means of market competition. Why is that bad? No, thank you. Even if you label this as merely retaliatory, this has the effect of benefiting the retaliatory company, because you can't always regulate the extent to which companies are going to retaliate, right? I think companies are going to try to use this resolution to accrue as much material gain for themselves as possible. What does this have the effect of? I think it weakens IP law, patents, innovation, because now these things can be stolen in the context where cyber attacks are legitimized as a form of market competition and also state warfare, right? I think the alternative on our side of the house is to entrench a better legal framework for dealing with these kinds of things. They say, oh, but the framework isn't capable of dealing with the situation right now, right? Then find a better legal framework. I don't think you should, I think the response to a gap in the law should be to fix the legal system, as opposed to finding an alternative for the legal system, especially if that alternative involves the use of private actors, oftentimes acting on the state's own authority or being interpreted as acting on the backing state's own authority, right? So what does this have the effect of? No, thank you. I think this seriously endangers the citizenry of the country from which that corporation is from, right? Because you get a fundamental moral hazard problem at work here. The corporation who is retaliating to that presupposed attack, and by the way, how are you going to figure out on what grounds I suspect this is from them is sufficient, right? So I think that's a problem with their case. No, thank you. So I think given the context in that the state is unable or unwilling to do so, the corporation doesn't have perfect information as to what the effects of their retaliation will be, right? If they are retaliating against another state actor, and that state interprets it as an attack on themselves and as a warfare attack, especially because many states interpret companies significantly associated with a particular country as proxies for that, the country. See, like Sony or Apple for Sony for Japan, or like Apple for the United States, right? Then that state, or even like that major company who is being retaliated against, can now really harm that state itself through other cyber attacks, or even through more conventional means of warfare, right? And so that significantly endangers the citizenry, who has no say under their side of the house as to whether or not this retaliation is good, or whether or not their lives are possibly going to be at stake. Yes?
Okay, look. The reason we're not talking about different corporations going to cyber war here is because if it's a case of another corporation attacking you, you're probably going to be able to sue that corporation through normal legal avenues. In fact, you're probably going to prefer doing that at the point at which you have lawyers and expertise and are used to doing this all the time. This is a debate about proxy groups and lone wolf hackers attacking big corporations trying to steal money.
Okay, so Well, you probably should have mentioned that in your first speech then, firstly. Secondly, like all of my analysis still applies to like what you suspect to be lone wolf state actors attacking corporations too, right? You still endanger the like country because you're possibly attacking against an actual state actor, and the state interprets your retaliatory attack as an actual act of aggression, especially if it's decentralized, right? If you suspect, oh, this is a lone wolf North Korean hacker who's attacking my company, I'm going to respond to like the North Korean government in this way, and the North Korean government actually didn't have control over that, then they're going to definitely interpret this as an active act of aggression, which is going to harm the state. Now, refutation point here, and also partly constructive, right? Why this will not actually deter any cyber attacks. So mutually assured destruction works when two parties are equally at stake with something to lose, right? So cyber attacks are not between two very equally powerful groups. They're often between like if you buy their analysis, right? Like one random person in North Korea who is really decentralized attacking like Lockheed Martin or Boeing or something like that, right? So these hackers are not going to care that much, especially if they're in a different state, that you simply find out their identity or their IP address, right? Because they don't have as much to lose as Google or Lockheed Martin or any other military corporation from this cyber attack, right? So you're not actually going to effectively deter anyone from doing the actions that you presuppose. And so this resolution is going to be ineffective in its main task. Okay, what's their, brief point of refutation then. This idea that this is a legitimate form of self-defense, right? You can do a lot of the things that they're saying, which is preventing further cyber attacks, by simply strengthening your own defensive system, right? I think it's weak to interpret retaliation as, oh, like I find out like the specific IP address from which this attack is coming from. And I think so I think you can do a lot of the benefits that they're trying to proclaim in a non-aggressive, non-retaliatory way. You can also involve the state if you do suspect it's a state actor like North Korea in this case, right? You don't have to go about it alone and possibly endanger the citizenry and millions of lives by your irrational actions by which you hold no stake because you're a corporate executive moving to some other country, and this is not going to endanger you. For these reasons, we're proud to oppose.
Member for that address, and I invite forward the Deputy Prime Minister. Here, here.
Yes.
Go on, lad.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, I'm going to look at two things. First of all, I'm going to look at why we promote free speech on our side of the House, and second of all, I'm going to look at the types of hackers that we're realistically likely to stop on our side of the House. First of all, some extensive rebuttal on what we hear out of side opposition. First of all, what we hear is essentially that the reason there is no response from the state is because the state has a good reason for that. There's for example, a better solution to the problem. We would argue that if the state does have a better solution to the problem, that probably counts as a response. This only works in the context of situations where the state is unable or unwilling. If the state is choosing other means to respond to something that is not a counter hack or whatever, then the state is not unable or unwilling to respond in this respect. Recognise also, they tell us that what they prefer is for the rule of law to decide. Well, obviously, we would prefer that too. But again, the same analysis replies. We're talking about situations that the rule of law does not and cannot apply for. In the absence of this, we think it's important that corporations do have some sort of response to this sort of immoral behaviour. Then what we get is a completely flawed conception of the types of actors that we're talking about in this debate. First of all, she says this is likely to be corporation on corporation attacks. This is not realistic. We tell you that, first of all, these are exactly the types of institutions where the legal response that they would prefer is most likely to happen, okay? You're most likely to sue another corporation. Why? Because it's easier, okay? If you know a corporation attacked you, recognise in order to respond, you need to know what corporation attacked you, okay? So if you know that's the case, then you're going to sue them. We think that's far easier. We think we're talking about situations where it's sort of underground proxy groups, okay? Recognise also, like sure, you can't steal a patent. I'm not quite sure what they're talking about there, but yes, you can cause economic harm on each other, okay? So recognize this as an incentive for corporations to not embark on this sort of behavior. Recognize this as completely sunk costs. If you know you're getting a response from corporations in retaliation, you're probably not going to embark in hacking, which will result in counter hacking and just both of you losing money for no obvious reason. Doesn't make sense. Next of all, she tells us, realistically, this is likely also to be state actors. We tell you that, like first of all, if the state actually is hacking someone, then we obviously do support action. That's a really bad thing. Like, recognize this is essentially an act of war, right? If the French army struts into Luxembourg and starts punching Apple workers in the face, you probably expect a state response to this. And in the absence of a state response to this, you would probably be in a position where you're morally justified to come up with some sort of response in and of yourself. And I don't think you should be particularly worried about the geopolitics of this, given that your state has fundamentally failed to protect you, okay? Realistically, the sorts of situations we're talking about is like proxy groups, okay? This is unlikely to cause international incidents. All we do is make hacking far less likely. Why? Because first of all, proxy groups can no longer guarantee on their anonymity, okay? We think crucially, this inhibits your ability to become a professional hacking group and rely on the income. Why? Because you know you're going to get a response that's going to cost you lots of money. This would be unideal. They're going to know who you are. Recognize this massively increases opportunity costs to the point at which individuals' identity is made available and the profits are considerably lowered because of this retaliation. Finally, we get some weird stuff about power disparity, about like Google hacking tiny little companies. Recognize one of two things is true. Either we don't find out that this is Google. If this is true, then this prop changes nothing. You can't retaliate against an attack that you don't know who it came from, okay? If we do know that it's Google, then on your side of the house, essentially, you're saying that Google will choose to hack somebody, then being found out, and that will be just fine. We'll keep on hacking other tiny little companies. We think this would be very bad for Google from a market perspective, at the point at which they have commercial incentives to not seem like a bully, otherwise people will stop using their services. First point of substantive, why this motion promotes free speech. Sydney.
If this company could predict that hacking would inflict more significant costs and still stand by the principle of your model.
We would still stand by the principle of a model, and that you should be able to respond to this. We think, for like, ultimately we can always fall back on the stuff you get out of Owen when he tells you this is a fundamentally immoral action. You should have a right to be able to respond to it, okay? We think ultimately all the incentives talk I gave you about why it's not in your commercial interest to seem like a bully is not going to change. If they could do it secretly, they would already be doing it. They don't do it, presumably. Free speech, okay. We think ultimately, a problem with hacking is it puts power into the hands of bad people to be able to limit free expression, okay? We think it's probably valuable that Hollywood can create a film that is like portrays Kim Jong-il in a sort of bad way, okay? We think this is probably a good thing. We think, like, not necessarily because it's a spectacular movie, but because it embodies the sort of free speech that they value, particularly in Western countries, okay? We think it's good that controversial issues can be covered for three reasons. First of all, this is just de facto free speech, which is something that we like. We should probably promote it insofar as that is possible to do. Second of all, this prevents essentially like acts of extrajudicial power from other states or other bodies. We think you shouldn't be able to curb things that happen in another country. We think that is bad. And thirdly, we think the effect that this has in places like Korea, in North Korea, is particularly positive. Why? Because you now create a film that like has this sort of message. It can be dropped into North Korea by South Korean activists via balloons. This is a thing, it does happen. And you can expose people to the outside world. You can expose people to the idea that maybe your leader is not a deity. Maybe he can't have like the best round of golf ever in history. We think this is probably beneficial even in these countries, okay? So essentially in the op world, directors, writers, these sorts of films. Producers are afraid to produce these sorts of films. Why? Because there are economic and security risks attached to that. This is bad. We think it's bad that you're held to ransom by these sorts of people. They create a stale, safety society, a safety industry where they're unwilling to push boundaries. We think that's bad. So finally, in my last minute, what sorts of types of hackers are we talking about? We think, first of all, like essentially the problem with the North Korean incident is that you're able to simultaneously imply and deny responsibility. The result of this is to allow North Korea to get the image boost that it wants, the strongman image of creating false conflicts with the West, without any of the retaliation involved, okay? The point at which we increase in opportunity costs to proxy groups and increase the likelihood that this attack is not going to look good for North Korea. We think this is less likely to happen, okay? We think you're ultimately disincentivizing these attacks for all these reasons, okay? We think in particular, this highly restricts the worst source of commercial attacks because anonymity cannot be guaranteed. But in interestingly recognize, like, we oppose hacking as an immoral action for all the reasons Owen gave you, okay? But much like acts of violence, which are immoral, we think there are circumstances where they might be justified. Crucially, we still allow these to happen. Why is this? Because look, when you believe in a cause so thoroughly that you don't mind your identity being exposed, you're probably still willing to do this. When you're willing to bear the economic cost because it's something that really matters, you're willing to do this. And when you believe that the company, once exposed or once hacked, you're likely to get support for your cause from the public, then the company or the corporation involved will not have the commercial incentives in order to retaliate in that respect, because it will be perceived as a bully for all the reasons I've given you. Look, what we do on our side of the house is disincentivize hacking, crucially the worst type of hacking. We think this is an immoral action. Propose the motion.
I thank the member for that address, and I invite the deputy leader of the opposition to close out the front half. Here, here.
Madam Speaker, I'm going to show you why we don't think any of their reasons for backing this motion stand, because they have based their justification principally on protecting corporation self-interest, which they have never justified to be our primary interest as a state backing this motion, and because we don't think that any of their analysis stands. We fundamentally stand behind the motion, or the idea that if a state is unwilling or unable to retaliate against these sorts of hackers, there's very likely, most probably, almost certainly, a very good reason why they should do so. And even if there isn't, in a small percentage of cases where they just don't have a good reason, but they're not able to, we think that we shouldn't back this motion because it violates the rule of law and it has other external negative effects, right? So we've told you, why might a state be unwilling or unable to intervene? If we are dealing with a state as the hacker, right? A state or a proxy for a state or someone that is associated with a state. We think that our state has a very good reason to adopt a more diplomatic or conciliatory approach and not retaliate. We think that it's fundamentally disingenuous for them to assert that a diplomatic reaction is retaliation, right? No, like a non-reaction is characterized under our side as diplomacy, right? You might say, look, we're not going to say anything to North Korea, even though we're pretty sure they're behind the attack on Sony, because we just do not want to antagonize them, because it's not worth it, because we've done a cost-benefit analysis and we don't care as much about this stupid movie or free speech or whatever as the state, right? That's the analysis that they are doing, right? They can't say that that's just retaliation. Then if it's a decentralized attack, if it's a lone wolf or a terrorist organization or that sort of thing, again, we might either fear some sort of antagonism, or we might just not care because we don't think that they're dangerous enough. And we mentioned this corporation against corporation analysis simply because it's another possible case in which this motion would apply. We say even in that case, even if they're not interested in defending that case, this motion would be useless, because we think that either, as they say, you could just sue them and this motion wouldn't apply, or we think it violates the rule of law, in which case, again, you have these additional harms, right? So what was their primary justification? Their primary justification is, they hit me, I get to hit them back, deterrence, right? So principally, we do not think deterrence is justified in and of itself just because the corporation feels harmed. Because why should we care about that corporation? I don't think that they have given you a justified reason to say that the corporation's interests, the corporation's self-interest, should be analyzed as ahead of or instead of the interests of the country as a whole. Vivian gave you extremely convincing analysis that the state, which is a proxy for the common interests of our citizenry, should get to make that cost-benefit analysis on its own and decide whether it wants to or is able to functionally respond if these corporations want to get us into some sort of conflict by launching the cyber attack retaliation, right? So if it is a state against the corporation, we think that non-state interaction with the attacking state is undemocratic, unregulated, and potentially dangerous. Vivian told you how this is a moral hazard. The people who are going to have effects based on this action, the citizenry, are not the ones who are deciding whether we're going to go in and antagonize the state. They haven't given you any analysis on why Sony launching a retaliatory attack against who we think is North Korea is not going to be interpreted as a US attack against North Korea. I think that it is possible with unstable states or proxy groups or states are going to be still going to respond to these attacks as if it's a nationalistic attack from the United States, because they clearly already see the Sony movie as some sort of state attack against them, right? Like, we don't think we can predict their actions. Go ahead.
For that to be an attack against North Korea would have to admit responsibility. Recognize as a corporation you're directly economically harmed by a cyber attack, and the political implications have no relation on that harm. Why is it not justified that you can remedy that yourself?
Because you cannot divorce yourself as a corporation from the political effects, right? I think that it is still relevant that it can have political effects, and the state may think that that is far more relevant than the fact that you can't release your movie or that you've lost some of your information, right? We think that like North Korea might have to admit that it was behind the attack if it gets mad at the US, but I mean, they haven't shown why that's like, they're definitely not going to do that in any case. And either way, they might still just feel offended and launch other attacks, right? If you know it's them, even if they don't admit that it's them, you're still antagonizing them. I don't think the corporation should be allowed to circumvent the rule of law to get around this, right? So if it's another state, this is interpreted as an act of aggression. We have good reason not to allow corporations to do this. If it's a terrorist group, either we think the state would care about this and would intervene if they are actually losing valuable information, or if the corporations are being attacked actually affect the state, or if they do not care, there's a good reason why they don't. Talking about lone wolves, right? These like small groups, right? Again, either the state cares, and if you have their information, like the state will sue them or pursue criminal action against them. But if the state doesn't care, and you think the only way to get at them is to attack them as this corporation, we don't think this even works under their deterrent effect analysis, because we think that they're not deterred because they don't have anything to lose, because they have no economic power. Even if you crash their server space is like cheap, so crashing their server doesn't make anything work, and they can be replaced by other groups. Like, none of this makes any sense, right? If there are other corporations, again, we told you, either there's no need for this motion, like they said, because you can just sue those other corporations, or you have small companies under this model that might be incentivized to sue Google because they don't have much to lose and because this works in their market incentive. We think that this wholesale encourages a violation of the rule of law, and we don't have any good reason to follow it except for corporation self-interest, which is not intrinsically justified, right? So we think that this is problematic, right? And they said, look, it'll be fine. It's regulated just by our model, like stipulation that the corporation will have to have a reasonable probability or reasonable reason that they are hacking the right person and just getting the minimal amount of information. That's ludicrous, right? By the time they're in court about this, they've already done it. If it's a strong corporation, they have very good lawyers. They can evade this, right? There is a full breakdown of regulation if you allow people to engage in hacking actions, in specifically retaliatory actions, which we do not think is just attempting to identify who hacked you, but is rather attempting to punish them, because all of their deterrent effects rely on there being some sort of punishment that is extrajudicially imposed by these corporations, right? We think that this is unacceptable. We don't think that there is any reason, whether a deterrent effect or state interest, to do this, and it has pernicious effects on the disintegration of the rule of law. For all of these reasons, we're proud to oppose. Thank you.
I thank the member for that address, and I invite forward the member of government. Here.
It's interesting how the opening opposition defends the violation of law, yet they're willing to allow the state to make their own rule according to the cost and benefit analysis, despite the fact that an entity in that state has been harmed by a foreign entity, right? This is unbearable and unjustified to say that you can make a cost-benefit analysis when giving justice to a corporation that is not only serving you as a country, but also serving the consumers that are also affected by this hack. So what will the closing government give to you? The closing government will give to you two things. One, will establish why justice on the basis of cost and benefit analysis will only lead to subjugation of corporations that technically don't mean much to the state, and thus, which means that you're basing justice on the basis of what you think is right and what you think is wrong. But more importantly, we'll also tell you why not only will deterrence work, but why even if we establish one, how we can't establish a legal framework, and even if we do establish a legal framework, if a government is really that worried about attacking North Korea because of political backlash, then we don't think that legal framework will be applied anyway, right? So even if a legal framework does exist, in the scenario where they're scared of the other opponent attacking, I don't think that legal framework will be of much use. And before we move on, let's answer a few questions, right? Rebuttals will, of course, be integrated. So first question is, will deterrence work? Here, the basic analysis proposed by the opening opposition is deterrence doesn't work because of two reasons. One, because for deterrence to work, you really have to be scared of the other opposition, in which cases, two things don't apply. That there's an imbalance of actors. It's usually small hackers attacking big corporations. Let's understand how mutually assured destruction works. Let's draw an analogy to the Cold War, the nuclear age, when it actually happened. Initially, of course, some country, Russia or USA, did have lesser amount of nuclear power, right? The fear of attacking back is what made them grow that power to the extent. However, the best part is they never really attacked, right? So we say that imbalance of power will be retaliated. However, they will never really attack each other on the basis that they're scared of being attacked back. So we think mutually assured destruction works in any form as long as it remains. But then they tell us, is deterrence justified? We say under our model, deterrence is better justified. Because they tell us if a corporation attacks another corporation in the nation, it will create national, it will be responded as a national attack. We say under our model, if the same thing happens, right? If the state is willing to attack the corporation on their own and poses a legal framework as well on that other entity, that will also be seen as a national attack. So we don't think how under their model that they're removing that problem of national attack, right? Because under both situations, instead, under our model, we make sure that if it's corporation versus corporation, it remains personal. Why? In the scenario where it's corporation versus corporation remains in a private spectrum, no state can blame each other, right? Which means North Korea can easily say, this was done by my corporation, I had nothing much to do with it, and the United States can say as such. Which means the national attack, geopolitical issues significantly reduced. But the last issue, will they retaliate or will they sue? We say they will sue not only because of the image and propagation, but also because when they sue, they get high amount of punitive damage and economic benefit that they can physically receive, right? That the benefits that they can actually understand. Instead, when they retaliate, they get nothing much back. They only get fear that something else which will retaliate you back harder. So we say that fear on its own, the mutually assured destruction bit, will ensure they go for the part that gives them more money. But before I move on, yes.
When companies sue, they have to admit that their security has been breached. Why would they want to do that?
Yeah, let's understand this. Under your model, even if the company is sued and their security has been breached, it's likely going to come into the spectrum of the people, right? So under this model, you already don't have much of an issue. But worse is, under your model, people will know the state will not protect you, and you have nothing much more to do. Which means, under your model, the company's reputation is worse ruined if this news by any chance comes out. But let's first understand how a state cannot make an excuse of justifying attacks. They say, when does a state care? We tell you a state only cares when to that state, that corporation seems either flimsy or intellectual property does not seem important enough. For example, the state does not retaliate when it comes to small corporations being hacked, or the state does not retaliate when it comes to digital media being hacked, because they don't think that's important enough. One, we think that's abhorrent in the sense that they're all corporations that are equally benefiting you. You cannot justify an attack based on just that excuse. But then they tell us that states don't attack because they're scared of the geopolitical scenario. Here we draw fine analogy on saying if the state decides that we don't want to protect the poor because my political leverage will go away, that the state does not want to defend the poor against the rich because the rich is what is giving me the political power, we say under a normal social model that would be abhorrent. However, because they think virtual properties are different from actual properties, they seem to deny that. Right? Which means if we can prove that the virtual properties are synonymous to that of actual properties, the state has no right to claim that this gives me more political leverage, so I shall give you no justice. So let's understand how the virtual property is similar to that of real property, right? So real property impacts individual on a personal level. We say virtual property does the same. But more importantly, a corporation's virtual property would not only impact itself, but its stakeholders, which are shareholders, consumers, and individual human beings on the grassroots level of that country, which means human beings and that consumer is impacted. Under their model, the state does nothing to this, so corporation continuously gets hacked, which means these human beings, these stakeholders, these shareholders suffer to the poorest level, right? Which means the country has a stake in it. It's just not the corporation that is being impacted. But then they tell us a legal framework can be evolved. We said one, a legal framework regarding the cyberspace is extremely difficult. Why is this? Because of the internal actions, right? Cyber attacks are not out in the open and that easy to track, which means they're very difficult within the system, which means you need a specialist that will need to do so. For a state to do this, they'll have to invest not only a huge amount of money, but also they might have to go into breaching privacy of every single citizen in that country to the point that they might have to overdo a lot of circumstances. So it becomes very difficult for the state to create a legal framework. But under their model, the characterization that they give of the state means that state will not be willing to even imply that legal framework because they're too scared of the geopolitical actions of that matter. But then they tell us individual interests don't really matter here. We've shown to you how the individual interests are directly linked. They tell us that retaliation cannot be regulated. We say this is an assumption under the fact that if you can't have a legal, if one, you can't regulate retaliation, then you can't also regulate the actual war going in between. We say you can regulate retaliation under these circumstances. You can regulate the retaliation of the entity that is within your country. However, it's that much more difficult to regulate the retaliation of the other country, right? So that's why we think the state should allow it when they can. The opposition needs to tell us why it's justified for the state to make rules up just because they think they have better socio-economic power, even though people are being harmed. They need to tell us why real property is different from virtual property and why this will not work. Thank you.
Members of that address, and I invite forward the member of opposition here.
Honourable Chair, the opening government shot themselves in the foot when they conceded consistently within their case that in an ideal world, it would be the state that prosecutes cybercrime, that in an ideal world, they wanted the state to be the one who effectively combated it. The tension for their case then, or the burden they set in this case, was to prove that the state could never stop cybercrime from happening. And the problem with that, and what we're going to bring you in extension, is that that's just not true. That while the state has systematically failed in the past to prosecute cybercrime, and while individuals, as the closing said, have been disadvantaged, that the principle remains the same, that it would be the ideal future, and that only with our model, where there's collaboration, where there's honesty, where there's systematic change, can that ideal situation the OG set up. What I'm going to do in this debate, firstly, is rebut the knife from closing off, where they change the goalposts, and explain why even if we accept those, that their case still falls short of the debate, go through some rebuttal that's left opening, and then move on to the far more important content in this debate, our extension, I would say that. So, firstly, why is the closing government's extension problematic? Well, firstly, because the exact tension of their extension and why it stands in contrast with their opening is that they said the state is actually a terrible individual to prosecute crimes because they have political interests, because otherwise they might ignore it. Therefore, individuals have an inherent right to just go and do whatever they want. That is, and of itself, a contradiction with what their opening said. But let's go and interrogate why this is wrong. Firstly, because currently cybercrime is illegal, and it is in fact equally accessible to most people. So the reason why the United States hasn't answered or like persecuted North Korea, even though we stand by our opening that they might have reasons not to, is because we're not at all sure that it was North Korea in the slightest. Because if you look at the analysis written by so many cybercrime people who are into that, specialists, all of them say there is no reason why that's necessarily true. And it's the exact suggestion of the opposition that we jump to the conclusion that it's the obvious evil bad guys, it's the obvious child pornographers at opening half, that therefore we're likely to engage in what are incredibly unjust retaliatory responses rather than just ones. But secondly, we like flat out deny the idea that the state isn't allowed to judge competing interests and prioritize some over others in democratic societies. Like there's a reason why I'm not allowed to be naked in this room right now, even though I might really want to. That's because the state says to you, Abigail, you get certain benefits from being part of this society. As a business, you get tax breaks, you get regulation, you get access to the system of suing that the opening gov thought was so good. And for that, you have to in some way also serve the state. We think the state firstly has that right and that utilitarian conception exists. They stood behind that importantly when we asked a POI about private individuals. Weirdly, if the government didn't want to or wasn't able to prosecute someone who robbed you, they still didn't think that you could go over to Nigeria and shoot them yourselves. We didn't know why that was why that was consistent in their case. But thirdly and finally, the response to that case is that those businesses have huge lobbying power within governments right now. What the government then should do maybe is help Sony build better firewalls, try and protect its companies. And those mean in the same way the opposition wanted to say that we could have self-defense or be skilled in protecting ourselves without individuals being able to go outside the boundaries of the law, undermine the state, and do whatever the hell they want. We thought that closing very clearly fell. But what was left in the opening half? 3 claims. Firstly, it's retaliatory and self-defense. Secondly, hackers are evil. And thirdly, the deterrence is more effective. That'll go into my material. Firstly, the idea that this is retaliatory and self-defense. Again, to point you to our POI, when we look at the actions of individuals who've been targeted, who've experienced loss, there's 2 criteria we set as to whether or not their actions are legally or morally, therefore, as we've decided by society, justified. Firstly, that they have to be in the moment. So at closing, we don't say you have to look at your servers being uploaded and go, well, they're already in the system, I'm screwed. We think that you can intervene in that moment and try and stop it. But it doesn't mean that after the harm has occurred, you can decide, well, that meant that I could shut down the entire server system of North Korea or that entire community, in order to take back what I thought was mine. Has to be in the moment. Secondly, has to be proportional. It's incredibly hard for individuals who are furious about economic loss, who want the harshest deterrent the OG wanted to set up, to decide that this will be where they stop hacking, that this will be the proportional response. And when you have a government who has started by endorsing that action in and of itself, it's very hard for the government to then go sue them. That was farcical. Secondly and quickly, hackers are not always evil. This isn't always people just stealing money. These are sometimes groups like Anonymous, which have hacked the Westboro Baptist Church, PayPal, MasterCard, Sony, who maybe are also creating social wrongs by being incredibly evil capitalist corporations. That's a conversation that deserves to be had with the public, not privately. They rule it out. Moving on. What do we want in this debate and how do we best get it? What we want in this debate, it sounds like a cheer, is the government to be able to actively and successfully persecute cybercrime. Why does their model stop it? 3 questions. Why is the state the best actor already conceded? Why are they currently not, and what is the trajectory? Okay. And thirdly, how does your model change that opening?
Okay, we don't need to prove that the state can never do this regulation, just that it isn't at the moment. Currently, as I've said, the state is incentivized to...
Okay, yeah, and I'm almost going to repeat some of your speech. I'm going to try not to. What we agree is that the state has failed in the past. It's changing. Why does your model stop it changing is the answer. Why is the state the best actor? As I've said, firstly, because they have the best access to knowledge and resources to accurately determine who or which individual committed the crime. Secondly, because they are proportional and accountable in the way, let's say, private military contractors have been proven consistently not to be. Thirdly, because they are consistent and equal. So under your system, only rich companies get to re-attack and no one else has recourse to the law. Fourthly and finally, because it's reflective of the public interest, as I've said in my rebuttal, we can see at the end of this debate that we want the state to be the actor that engages it. Why is it currently not doing that? Firstly, because less than 2% of cybercrime is reported. Why is that? We flagged in a POI. It's because individuals don't want to admit when their systems are breached. They would rather deal with it privately because they lose funds when people know that information has gone out. Secondly, because companies who make money off being a private contractor have no interest in collaborating with the government. It's not profitable. What does that mean? It means all the political apathy the opening government talked about exists right now. Where are we headed though? Because the reality is changing. In 2013, the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Partnership started in Britain. It's being funded by 1.4 billion. And you know why that exists? Because companies are starting to collaborate with the government to create legal and ethical outcomes. What are these outcomes we're talking about? Firstly, that non-reporting ceases to exist. When you can attack a company privately, why the hell would you tell your investors that you were attacked in the first place? Secondly, a loss of skill. There are only so many people who have this. When they work for private corporations, they don't work for the government, they don't work for every other actor who you thought deserved defense. It ends the culture of information secrecy and of allowing these people to get away with it. What did we want? The closing oppositions model. We're proud to propose.
I'd like the member for that address, and I invite the government whip board to close out that bench. Here we go.
Done.
The opposition teams consistently tell us about increasing legal standards and having better avenues. But until the member speech, there was absolutely no evidence of what these legal standards are and what the implications are going to be. They tell us that companies can collaborate. However, ladies and gentlemen, as Wasifa has pointed out over and over again, it's not that a lack of legislation is the problem. The problem, as they both opening and closing have accepted, is that there are a number of incentives which make the state not opt into a lot of these factors in the first place. They needed to tell us why, even in the presence of the modern world, these incentives have some reason to change. There was absolutely no analysis on that front. What are we going to talk about? This debate is essentially about which actor is the best actor, right? And what sort of incentives there are. So we'll talk about three things broadly. Number one, what are the rights of individuals and entity corporations, and what happens as a result, and again, who's the best actor. So before we right now, as the opening clarifies that not much really happens. In some cases you report, in most cases you don't.
Sir.
Let's ask why. Because in most cases there's no justice. An individual who gets hacked on his Facebook account loses all his information, or even worse, gets hacked and all his social security numbers and bank details are taken away from him, does not report because he does not think he can get meaningful recourse, right? The problem in most of these cases is there is no meaningful recourse because the state frequently chooses not to do this. But more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, what are in terms of international crime, what are the incentives? They tell us that foreign policy problems are there, right? They've never told us what these foreign policy issues are or what sort of escalation is. But more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, they frequently ignore the entire analysis by Wasifa when we told you that the housing country where the attack comes from has no responsibility, no incentive to divulge this information, i.e. the North Korean government is never going to tell you where the attack originated from. They're just simply going to say, we don't really know, guys, I'm so sorry, you can do your own research, which means even if international treaties are there, even if there are all sorts of legal standards are there, you have no meaningful access to this information. You cannot implement these laws. They never told you how under model changed. So let's understand the idea of rights. The opening half is a very bizarre way of saying that justice should be subject to cost-benefit analysis. We never saw any meaningful analysis to why that's true. They never told us, ladies and gentlemen, what's okay then for a state to say, I will not prosecute the rich guy who ran over you because there is political capital, and I think like the judge will lose his seat or whatever, right? So ultimately, justice is not necessarily in cases where individuals are involved. Justice is not a case of cost and benefit. You prosecute first, and then you see what happens, right? The closing half then sort of nuances this by saying that, look, there are competing interests involved. But these sorts of cases where hacking has taken place, where corporate interests have been violated, there are no competing interests. Individuals have been violated to extent, and then they say, no, these are big corporations. Understand this. In a lot of cases, well, in all of these cases, these big corporations have this information, and this information is generally about people. For example, when American Online got hacked for 1.6 million of its accounts, and all their personal details were out, these were individuals on the ground who got hacked. These were individuals whose lives were ruined as a result because the information was gone. We tell you, if the competing interests are there to protect companies or whatever, we don't necessarily think that's a good enough justification to actually merit this sort of a response, right? But before I move on, upper house.
Okay, the state is not an arbitrary rule maker who isn't noticing poor corporate interests or randomly changing domestic law, right? No matter how much corporations care or contribute to the state, that doesn't mean they can circumvent the law or the state as a proxy for democratic will, because we're talking about extra state relations. This is
the idea here is law is only as good as the enforcement, right? You can have any number of laws to do whatever on earth you want. However, so long as the law is not being implemented under their model, ladies and gentlemen, it's especially worse when the state refuses to actually have enforce the law, which means the state consciously sends a message that I may have the law, but I do not have the will to do it. So we don't know why we have to justify that. So what happens, ladies and gentlemen? They tell us that rule of law from the upper house. We said rule of law not taken, ma'am. Rule of law will be upheld. They never told us why this rule of law will be upheld or how the state's incentives change. So then they make this assertion that look, this is going to escalate into big warfare, right? Have you ever seen a scenario in which that happens? No state will go to war over internet attacks, ladies and gentlemen, and that's quite bizarre for them to see how the end game of escalation works out at all. More importantly, ladies and gentlemen, then the closing house talks about how the state should fund firewalls and actually security as opposed to retaliation. Obviously, that should be done, and companies and states both have incentive to do that. They never told us why this was mutually exclusive. Then they tell us that no. Under our model, it's worse because you don't have incentive to actually put this information out there or reporting. Ladies and gentlemen, and when these hacks are done, this information is usually public anyway. The moment Sony got hacked, it's in the incentive of hackers to make this information public. AOL got hacked, this information was public. The government of Estonia got hacked, this information was again public. So i.e., by its very nature, the point of hack is to show that I have this information, which means your systems are bad. I.e., this information will be in the public domain regardless. So the incentive for suing is there under our model. But more importantly, therefore, never refuse to us about the monetary benefits of suing and actually getting better responses, right? Because of the huge amount of punitive costs there. The only reason that when individuals or entities actually will go and counter on retaliation when they have absolutely no other option, and we think that's a good enough recourse, right? Then they tell us that no, state should be the ideal actor. Again, lower house made no analysis as to how state incentives change. Why America, when it thinks it's going to be a foreign policy clusterfuck, or for whatever reason, chooses not to engage with North Korea at all, right? So they never told us why that happened. But more importantly, they tell us that look, even within these state borders, for whatever reason, there is going to be collaboration. We tell you collaboration and incentive for collaboration is there under our model too, because companies don't want to take the route of retaliation because that has its own cost. Ideally, they want to use the state structure. So what does our world look like, ladies and gentlemen? Our world, there is a number of problems, but understand, the biggest problem here in the entire opposition bench was the state chooses not to do this when there are bigger foreign policy concerns. The reason for this is any attempt to police these things is seen as a direct attack by that individual state. Under our model, the state can successfully distance itself from the retaliatory attack the extension Masima was talking about. What does this look like, ladies and gentlemen? This means when a US corporation like Sony then goes on the retaliatory attack against Korea, not only is there deterrence because those hackers have been down, they are not seen as actors of US, ladies and gentlemen. They're seen specifically as Sony. I.e., the state can actually do this exact same thing that the perpetrators are doing by saying, hey, I don't know where this attack came from. We don't necessarily know if Sony did that, at the same time distancing themselves from the event while also contributing to the entire process of deterrence, ladies and gentlemen. We make sure that justice is there. It's not an option we want to explore. But when the state actively says we don't care about rules, we think citizens should have the leeway too. Thank you.
Remember, for that address, I invite the opposition whip to close out their bench and the round.
When you give a man a gun and say it's a private matter, you can retaliate, you can shoot someone who's fled your house through a robbery, they're more likely to shoot, they're less likely to seek out the state. The state's less likely to put pressure or have pressure put upon them to develop legal infrastructure from that crime occurring in the first place. That was the extension we brought you, and one that was supported by all three teams in this debate. I'm going to do two things in this speech. First, I'm going to talk about why this undermines state infrastructure and that's a bad thing, and second, look at why this isn't a legitimate action. First thing I want to say is from opening government, we heard the idea that if you know it's a corporation, you'd probably sue them. It was unclear why the same logic didn't apply to if you knew it was an individual who, by their own logic, at this point, the companies have identified. So if in terms of that suing analysis, if they're willing to sue a corporation, then they're probably also willing to sue an individual or a private group at the point where they know that private. The problem is we told you that corporations are likely to act disproportionately in a different way. What did we hear from closing government that challenged the premise of our extension? The first was that the state is a bad group because they have political aims. The first response is this: they never told us why that was a bad thing in and of itself. When the state makes decisions to say go to war, we say this is a similar attack in the way that people treat cyber attacks. The fact that we don't even know it was North Korea, but we just used the words North Korea. It wasn't, North Korea, it was a bunch of people, but the way that we talk about it is an act of war is a state action. A couple of other examples though. First is that the state's legitimacy is built on prosecuting these cases. And also, the states aren't the ones in the courtroom deciding how that case plays out. The state has an interest in establishing the rule of law, and that rule of law is much more likely to apply equally than, say, the ability of a corporation through its own money to prosecute that retaliation. Your policy tells only rich companies that they have the ability to respond and doesn't say that poor companies have the ability. Fourthly, is that the way that states are likely to react is more do things like set up defense mechanisms, employ people that prevent that attack from occurring, which applies equally across the board, as we've been trying to do, but has been undermined by their extension. Go.
One, state can always do that mutually exclusive. But the bigger issue is if a state refuses to give justice to an individual in all circumstances because they think there's a better outcome, why do you think that's justified?
We think that it is justified because they have the democratic mandate. The second is we don't think that will occur. The justice is applied equally when the laws and framework is established. Third, you can't just say it's not mutually exclusive. That was our extension. Sucks that you guys can't respond again. I assume you wouldn't be able to think of a response because it's pretty sick. Okay, what happens under your policy? Closing government came up and said, this is a private matter. That was exactly the problem, because that's the norm you establish among corporations, particularly, as we pointed out in a point of information, they already have incentives to lock in information. You provide the norm that corporations can deal with them, with other groups privately, and the government shouldn't be involved. What happens under our system? The only option you have is then to collaborate with the government, to information share, to lobby the government as Sony to develop infrastructure, and to allow more skill for that sort of attack or defense to be available where otherwise they're being privately employed by private companies. That means the government, for the first time, not only has more information, which we told you at the moment was only 2%, secondly, not only has more skill, but has more political pressure on it and more collaboration to put those policies in place and establish infrastructure that's going to prevent it. What did we hear in response to that? Well, they said people will never report because they think there's no recourse. That was just assertive. And if we can prove to you there's more likely recourse on our side than their side, we increase the reporting and we get a win from that issue. That means that by the end of this debate on that issue, what we've given you a closing opposition is a stronger government response and one that more effectively prevents that crime occurring rather than a retaliatory response that is a gunfire approach.
Please explain how better domestic legislation in the UK or the US will stop North Korean proxy hackers from causing illegitimate economic harm and curbing free speech. Only a retaliatory loss of economic power.
All right, that's very cheeky. It's not legislation, it's state capacity. It's things like state employing people, it's things like having servers, it's things like preventative cybersecurity, which at the moment are being outsourced, or by your model will be outsourced to private companies with different incentives. So, there you go. Second question, why is this an illegitimate action? The first reason, no. The first reason is there's no democratic legitimacy. We told you often these attacks involve a degree of political motive, and the response should be equally politically determined. Businesses shouldn't be able to act around the law, which is why we POI'd about our individuals, because they were never happy to do that, because apparently someone who's been scammed out of $1 million through a dating site hasn't experienced economic loss. We didn't think that was true. The second response was implicitly, they said, this is self-defense, although they didn't say it in those words. You wouldn't say allow someone who's just had their house robbed to chase after a person down the street, yell abuse at them and say mean things, and then shoot them in the back, because that is not something that's in the fact. It's not proportional. Why is this analogous? Firstly, this is a retaliatory attack that takes place after the initial attack takes place. Otherwise, what you would do is just empower companies to stop the action in the moment, not retaliate. Second thing is it's not proportional or more likely to be disproportionate. Couple of reasons. Firstly, in the way that empirically states have acted, because they have more at stake, they're likely to consider those actions. Whereas companies are more likely to pass a brown bag to a private hacker or an individual lone wolf and say, just stop this happening again, which is why you're more likely to see an entire government targeted, where states otherwise wouldn't target a government. That's why you're more likely to see groups targeted, because companies have different incentives. What was the fourth reason that this was illegitimate? We told you we just don't know, and companies are more likely to act quicker and off the gun than states are. So the fact that Sony, if it was empowered to have retaliatory attacks, perhaps they did, you're more likely to see a shutdown of North Korea's systems over and above, say, what the US government would do. Then they told us, well, cybersecurity is the same as real property. That was this 20-second extension, or one of their extensions from closing government. If that were true, what we would not allow is you to steal something from me and then me to chase you down and steal something from you as a form of justice. What we would do is try and strengthen the ability of governments to stop that theft occurring and then prosecute that theft in a fair and even way. At the end of this debate, something is clear. This is a crazy, crazy disproportionate response from vigilante corporations that otherwise would not be empowered. They undermine the legal system, they undermine legal infrastructure, and what we prefer is exactly what opening government wanted: state action.
Hold on.